Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Podcast. My name is Jason Harden. I'm here with Carson Crow, and we're opening the Bible in search of fuel for your spiritual journey. This is where we talk about life the way it was meant to be and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in the 21st century. Wherever you are, thanks for joining us on the journey today. Carson, I don't know about you. You have had a bit of a topsy-turvy year. It is hard for me to believe that this is the very end of August. What about you?
It is flying by. Yeah. It feels like January 2nd to me.
You are not where you were when the year started, and we're thankful that you're here, of course. And this year is absolutely flying by. We are at the very tail end, not just of a month, but we can feel summer beginning to wane down around us, and there's a lot to look forward to. But last Friday and today, we are just devoting these 2 Fridays before the beginning of a new month, just reflecting on our daily Bible reading. I am so encouraged by the members of our church family who follow along with this simple schedule that we have been using for years and years. Even just this past Friday, we got feedback from some who not only listened, but were reading right along with us and expressed appreciation for us flying in tandem with that. And so we want to do that again today. Our key text is from 1 Kings chapter 17. And so it may be that a listener isn't following along and maybe wants to go back and read that chapter before continuing on. This is right here in the heart of the Old Testament. We have the northern kingdom of Israel has separated from the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel is ruled by one wicked king after another, and I think you could easily make the argument maybe we have hit the bottom of the barrel in 1 Kings chapter 17 during the reign of a man named Ahab. But no matter how dark it got in Israel, God always conveyed his will. And you see that at the very beginning of 1 Kings chapter 17, where God seemingly out of nowhere raises up a prophet named Elijah, and he says, I want you to go. I want you to stand before King Ahab, and I want you to tell him it is not going to rain for years except by my word. That is going to be quite a drought. And Elijah delivers that message. There is a terrible drought that cripples that northern kingdom of Israel. That's kind of our context. But Carson, we're really going to zero in the middle of the drought when life gets tough, not just for Ahab and the inhabitants of Israel, but for Elijah and a specific woman here in 1 Kings 17.
Yeah, in verse 8 through verse 16, we find this story in the midst of the drought, a very famous story that likely many of our listeners have heard and read before, the story of Elijah and his interaction with a widow and her child. But before we read that, verse 8 through 18 or 16 in just a moment, what I would point the listeners towards and what I would remind them of is that this story is much deeper than it might appear on the surface. While it seems maybe a little bit bizarre what happens, maybe a little bit straightforward, the miracle that would take place, this is a moment in Scripture that is pointing us to Jesus. And I don't just say that because the parallels are there, the similarities are there, they're all obvious throughout the text that we'll read, because Jesus himself would point back to this moment and say, you know what, that was a little bit about me. You see that in Luke chapter 4. I would point our listeners there as they're reading the text today. In Luke chapter 4, you have that famous verse in verse 24. Truly I say to you, no prophet is welcome in his hometown. And here's what Jesus says next. We often don't read this part. But I tell you the truth, that there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut, and for 3 years and 6 months was a great famine that came over all the land. And yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And so again, that's often a verse we miss after that very, very famous one. This is a moment, 1 Kings chapter 17, 8 through 16, that Jesus interjects himself. It is a shadow, it is a taste of who he will be and what his ministry will look like. And so let's read that right here, right now. 1 Kings 17, beginning in verse 8. The word of the Lord came to him. It's talking about Elijah, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and say there, Behold, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. And so he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called her and said, Please give me a little water in a jar that I might drink. It sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? Verse 11, and as she was going to get it, he called to her and said, Please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. But she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have no bread, only a handful of flour in the bowl, and a little oil in the jar. And behold, I am gathering a few sticks that I may go in, prepare for me and my son, that we may eat and die. Verse 13, then Elijah said to her, Do not fear, do as you have said, but make me a little bread cake from it first, and bring it out to me. And after you make it, one for yourself and for your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the bowl of flour shall not be exhausted, nor the jar of oil be empty, until the day the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth. Verse 15, so she went and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and her household ate for many days. The bowl of flour was not exhausted, nor did the jar of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord, which she had spoken through Elijah.
Yeah. I so appreciate, before we read that, you reminding us that Jesus himself referenced this scene, and when we are reminded to read it in view of Jesus, I think, like you just briefly highlighted, there are things that just light up. You know, every once in a while you might teach or preach from later in Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 24, where Jesus is on the road to Emmaus with a couple of men, and we read, Luke tells us, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, listen to that, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And every once in a while you might read that and be like, well, what things? I think this is a great example of that. So Carson, as you zero in on this little scene, what stands out to you about what we can learn as we ourselves head into this weekend?
Something that stood out to me that maybe I haven't thought about before is who God calls to help his servant. It could have been a centurion. It could have been a wealthy man. It could have been kings and princes. In verse 9, the Lord simply says, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. It's almost a funny statement to read. When you think back to that day and what the life of a widow might look like, I have provided a widow to provide for you. Yeah. One of the poorest in the community, one of those who were desolate, often obsolete to society and the economy. This was the person God said, she will be of help to you. I think that's a really good reminder there for us that God can use anyone he chooses. You don't have to be prominent. You don't have to be a wealthy individual. You don't have to have the most flamboyant talents in the kingdom to be of use. When God needs help for his servants, God can use just about anybody. And so it's a good reminder there for everyone to make sure we value people equally to ourselves if we have maybe talents and resources they don't, but also a good reminder there for us if we are maybe doubting our worth in the kingdom, doubting our usefulness, God can use you. The question is, will you wait at the gate as he commanded the widow?
Yeah, I like that. One of the things that has always fascinated me about this account is it's hard to imagine being in a drought that is this severe. That is what is being described. But Elijah is quite literally living in the answer to his own prayer. And I think maybe that's easy sometimes for us to overlook. God, we know, sends him with a message. James, especially in the New Testament, highlights the fact Elijah prayed that there would be no rain as God commanded him to pray, and it did not rain. But you notice that prayer didn't necessarily make Elijah's life easier. I think sometimes it's easy for us to jump to that conclusion that if I pray, and especially if I am praying according to the Lord's will, that means that my life is going to get easier. No, not necessarily. But it very well may have some small part to do with the accomplishing of God's purposes. And that's exactly what's going on, right? God's purposes were bigger than Elijah, but God didn't forget Elijah. While he was out there at the brook Kerith, God provides ravens to bring him bread and meat in the morning and the evening. He drank from the brook. Eventually the brook dried up because there was no rain, because Elijah prayed like God told him to. But I love how you bring us from the brook to the house of this woman. I would just add about this woman, how remarkable her frame of mind. She is very straightforward in what she's doing with these sticks. She is a woman in absolute despair. I mean, she has given up. She is preparing what she believes will be the last meal for herself and her son. But she hears from the prophet, "Do not fear, but I do need you to act in faith. Don't fear, but go and do as you have said. Use what little you have left and make a meal for yourself. Would you be willing to share it with me?" And I'm telling you, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, has said. Again, I think maybe it's easy for us to slip into a frame of mind. Okay, God tells me not to fear, which means I'm just going to sit and wait for God to change things. No, this is one of so many times in Old and New Testaments, God communicates, don't fear, but I need you to act in faith. And this woman doesn't have much, but when she is willing to lay on the line the little that she has in faith, she is putting it in the hands of a wonder-working God who knows exactly what he's doing.
Well, can I add something to that?
Yeah.
The story is so interesting in the verbiage of the story. And I think a lot of it is pointing to Jesus, all these various allusions to him, whether it be his interaction with the widow, whether it be an allusion to the feeding of the 5,000 that we see in verse 14, or allusion that we'll talk about later to rising someone from the dead who's a widow's child. But in verse 10, what is the very first question that Elijah asks? He says, "Will you give me a little bit of water?" And then what does it say in verse 11? I think this is really important because it teaches us or maybe convicts us of something we need to hear. In verse 11, it begins, "As she was going to get it." And then what does he do? He asks for something more.
Yeah.
Right? How easy would it have been for the woman to look at the Lord or look at Elijah and say, "Haven't I done enough?" Right? It's a drought season. What is a drought season? Not a lot of water. And yet she willingly and graciously is going to get him some. And then he says, I need a little bit more from you.
Yeah.
I think there are so many times in my life where I am willing, based on my conviction and based on my level of faith and based on just my sympathy and empathy for others, I'm willing to go get the cup of water. What I've found in my life to be true more times than I'd like to admit, I struggle to go further than that when they ask for more. And to have that compassion, just like the Good Samaritan that you preached on Sunday night, not just to help him up, but to bring him into the inn and give him what he needs fully. And so I think that's really important for us just to hear, especially as we get to the end of the week and we get tired and we get exhausted. Are we having compassion and displaying the empathy and sympathy to the bare minimum? Or are we actually going above and beyond, carrying the coat a mile or two the way Jesus would expect us to in this world? This widow didn't say, I've done enough. She ultimately would give not just her water, but give her bread.
Yeah. You mentioned Jesus, and I think that's going to be a great note to round this conversation off on. You highlighted verse 10, bring me a little water that I may drink. Boy, that sounds a lot like John chapter 4, Jesus talking with the Samaritan woman at the well, right? He has already highlighted in the passage that you read from Luke's gospel, this woman was a Gentile, right? She was outside of Israel, and yet we see not just Elijah, but Jesus himself having this interaction with a Gentile woman, and that woman in some way stepping out in faith. You briefly referenced it earlier, but where else do you see Jesus in this text as a bridge all the way to us today?
Well, you particularly see it at the end of the story, a famous end to the story found in verse 17 through 24, where this woman gives and gives, and the Lord is faithful to his promise that when she gives Elijah the bread and the oil, it is not depleted, but it remains flourishing for the time of the drought. But in verse 17 through 24, you see that she once again encounters a valley, that she goes from the valley of the drought to a mountain moment where the Lord is faithfully providing, to once again experiencing heartbreak and ruin when her son dies. One of the interesting things, I think there's a lot of parallels to Jesus in the gospel in verse 17 through 24, where ultimately, as our listeners likely know or have read today in their Bible reading, the son is raised to life in the end. I think there's a lot of parallels. One, obviously, being Jesus would do that. He would raise a widow's child in the Gospel of Luke and Luke 7. But just something stood out to me about verse 18, and I think I just want to read that for us and maybe consider that for just a moment. In verse 17, the son dies from a sickness, and so she comes to Elijah in verse 18 and says this, "What do I have to do with you, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and put my son to death." And so what happens, in my own words, in this story is the son dies, and who does the woman go to blame? She goes to blame Elijah, and particularly she thinks in the story that Elijah is rebuking her, he's punishing her for the ways in which she's sinned, which ultimately manifests in the death of her child. What does that have to do with the gospel, and how does that echo the gospel, that question and that statement of the woman? Well, it would be the inverse, would be reality for us. Our iniquity would be not brought into remembrance by the killing of our own son, our own flesh, but it would be God who would give up his son to cover and to pay for our iniquities. And so again, I love the story because there's so many just superficial things to see, easy things to see. But when you dig deeper, line by line, you see why Jesus would choose this story to interject himself. It would just be this foreshadowing, not just what his ministry would be like, not just the things he would do, but ultimately it would be a moment where we see the fulfillment of the gospel, where God doesn't kill the child of the woman because of her sins, but rather he would give up his son to die for ours. I just love that connection.
Yeah, that is a powerful connection. And I love how by the end of the chapter, in talking with Elijah, she has referred to the Lord, your God, right? And in verse 18 that you referenced, "O man of God, what have you against me?" What we have as the end of the chapter is, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth." It is truth. And of course, like you've brought up, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the ultimate sign, the ultimate proof that he was not only a man of God, he is the man of God. In fact, he is the Lord, right? Who goes into the grave in order to come out of the grave, not just to prove who he was, but to accomplish this forgiveness and this redemption that you've highlighted for us. Let's be honest. First Kings is not the easiest book in the Bible to read, but there is a reason why on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, we read not just a chapter from the New Testament, but we also read from the Old Testament, because if we want to understand what Jesus was describing, where we started this episode early on in Luke's gospel, we need to know this story, right? We need to know the story of Elijah. And so we appreciate not just our listeners to this podcast episode, But we appreciate the members of our church family near and those who maybe aren't even members of our family who continue to read the Bible right along with us. Carson, I know of no better way to spend 20 minutes on a Friday than by reading a chapter from the Bible and just talking about it and seeing signs of Jesus and having our faith built in this God who works wonders in Old and New Testament. Anything that you would say here to carry with us as we head into the weekend from 1 Kings 17?
I would say the application, I think there's a good one to make for the weekend. We focused a lot today, and rightfully so, on the widow and her faith and her sacrifice. But I would just say, be an Elijah.
Yeah.
Be an Elijah. What did Elijah first and foremost do? He went where God told him to go, right? He could have pouted, he could have sat, he could have done nothing there by the river, but instead the Lord said, go to this woman, go to this soul, and she will provide for you. And what I'll just say to our listeners today is God has given you a very, very similar command. He's told you to go to unlikely people and to speak with them, and to speak about the things that Elijah would speak about, the water, or in the case in John's gospel, the living water Jesus would talk to the woman about. And so my application for you Friday and Saturday is this: go like Elijah. Go to the people that you don't expect to hear the gospel. Go to the people that maybe you have been putting off because they seem like unlikely people to be of service in the kingdom or receptive to the kingdom message. Go as God told Elijah. Jason, what about you? What's your final takeaway?
I think allow yourself to be helped was what came to my mind as you were wrapping up. It is easy for me to imagine Elijah saying, what do you mean go and be taken care of by a widow? I have just done the incredible. I have stood before the king of Israel himself and lived to tell about it. And I am afraid that many of us have a heart to help, but we're not willing to admit when we could use help, when we could use some assistance. And so not only be an Elijah, but allow yourself to be vulnerable and allow other people to serve where they can. Those are both reminders that we need to hear as we head into this weekend. Carson, thanks for joining me today. Thanks to all of you for listening to the Heaven Bound podcast. We hope our simple conversation has helped you set your mind on things above and given you a little more fuel for the journey. Always remember, when you're walking with Jesus, you're heaven bound, and the best is yet to come.